Good afternoon. Welcome to the Acton Institute. My name is Stephen Barrows, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Acton, and we are delighted to collaborate with the Austrian Economics Center to co-host today's Free Market Roadshow. The Free Market Roadshow partners with leading think tanks, scholars, business professionals, and policy experts to discuss solutions to some of the most pressing issues of the day, such as individual freedom, democracy, cost of living, government debt, and much, much more. The goal of the Free Market Roadshow is to illuminate the importance of the free and responsible individual to securing our prosperity. In 2025, the Free Market Roadshow commemorates a milestone in the history of free market ideas, specifically the 50th anniversary of Friedrich Hayek's Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. With his speech in December 1974, his Nobel speech, The Pretence of Knowledge, Hayek challenged the foundations of central planning and emphasized the importance of humility in policymaking. So today, I am joined by two distinguished panelists, both of whom have an extensive scholarly and popular publication record in the fields of economics and entrepreneurship. So I'd like to introduce first Dr. Per Bylund, who is Associate Professor of Entrepreneurship and Johnny D. Pope Chair in the School of Entrepreneurship in the Spears School of Business at Oklahoma State University. His scholarly career follows previous experiences as systems developer and business consultant, an elected politician, and an entrepreneur. So welcome, Per.
Thank you.
Our second panelist is Dr. Dave Hebert, who is a senior research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. He was formerly a professor at Aquinas College, Troy University, and Ferris State University. He has also been a fellow with the U.S. Senate Committee on the Budget and has worked with the U.S. Joint Economic Committee. So welcome, Dave.
Thanks so much.
So just for our audience, both online and in the room, today's format will be roughly 35 to 40 minutes of interaction with our panelists, at which point I will cut to the audience, both here in the room, and there will be microphones available for you to ask your own questions on this important topic and Friedrich Hayek's insights into economics. So with that, I'd like to kick it off by just getting each of your observations and maybe just a general question. You know, I'm an economist myself. I've read some of Hayek's writings. He's a brilliant person. But I'd like to know, begin first with you, Per, what is it about Hayek's ideas that has had the most impact on your own professional development and education?
So I really like his early stuff. So I reading his Prices and Production, which is his lectures from the London School of Economics in the early 30s, which I think is basically what gave him the job there. And also, I'm enough of a nerd to think that his pure theory of capital is not only a read that you can understand, which I guess most people can't, but it's also a good read and a very interesting read. So I really like his capital stuff.
Terrific. You know, his capital stuff, and also then when I think about capital, I think about it, all the things that he brought into sort of business cycle theory and why we have recessions and so forth. So yes, thank you. How about you, Dave? What are some of the insights that you appreciate about Hayek?
Yeah, so I really just love what Hayek says, particularly in the essay that we're going to be talking about today, the idea of humility. And so as any student of economics can tell you, you know, in your first couple classes, you're given equations for supply and demand, you know, you solve for equilibrium, there's an answer, right? And it's all just right there, clear as day, you know, no ambiguity at all. But then you get into sort of the weeds and maybe an intermediate micro or intermediate macro, you know, course. And even there, you're given sort of a production function and, you know, how much output should a firm make and what should they charge? Well, there's an answer to that. And so then you start wondering, you know, okay, I'm 19 years old. Why can't businesses figure this out? Like, why does business even exist as a degree, right? And so, but then you read Hayek and you find out like, oh, wait a minute. These equations don't actually exist in the real world. We can't know them. All we can do is perhaps act as if we had access to them at best. And so that humility is really what struck me, is that, yes, economics is incredibly powerful, but it's also limited in a way that prevents us from making, you know, what we might call point predictions. But that doesn't mean we can't make pattern predictions. And so that was really just an eye-opening experience for me the first time I encountered, you know, Hayek's work. And subsequent times just refine that again and again and show me new insights every time I read Hayek.
So can you elaborate a little bit more? I'm intrigued with this idea of point predictions versus pattern predictions. So can you elaborate a little bit more? So are you saying that you can't plug and chug an algorithm to get a certain answer, but there's general things that you can understand, or what do you mean?
Yeah, so what I mean by that distinction between like a point prediction and a pattern prediction. So we all know that, if the price of gasoline were to rise by $1.50 a gallon, right, we would all buy less. Well, how much less, right? That how much less, that precision, that would be a point prediction. But I know the pattern is that as prices rise, I'm going to consume less of whatever it is I'm purchasing. If prices fall, I'm going to consume more of it. How much more is going to depend on a whole host of various goods and topics, the differences between substitutes, the availability thereof, how pressing my need is for it right now versus can I plan and find alternatives. And so I know that in the medium to long run, yes, if the price of gas were to rise by $1.50, I will find a substitute for it. But I don't know exactly how much everyone else is going to respond, and I don't know exactly how much I personally even will respond.
Thank you, Dave. And Per, you had a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. I mean, it's a really good point. And something that Austrians are sometimes critiqued for is that we know the theory of the business cycle, like you mentioned, but we can't really tell when it will happen. Right. And that's exactly what Dave just said, that we know the pattern. We know that printing a whole lot more money is going to set the business cycle process in motion. We just don't know when it's going to happen. Right. So, and I mean, had we known, then of course we would invest in the boom and sell just before the bust. Right. But we can't. We just know that there will be a bust eventually.
Yes. So you had mentioned earlier the idea of Hayek's insights into capital and the structure of capital. And of course, many of the debates that occurred earlier in the 20th century were over the causes of the Great Depression, whether or not there should have been something that the government should do more of or less of. Should we let the market just play itself out, or should we end up doing significant intervention? And of course, that brings us to a big debate between Keynes and Hayek. And so let's go back to you again, Per, and this idea of humility and what the distinctions were between what, say, Keynes would say we should do and what Hayek would say. So how would you characterize the distinction between those two?
Well, Keynes was a statist, so he would just say, let's let the government do it. I mean, simply put. Whereas Hayek would say that, no, these are problems and these are malinvestments in the marketplace, which means there's too much invested in certain types of production and too little in other types of production. So the whole production apparatus does not fit with what consumers actually want, or at least what entrepreneurs believe that consumers want. So the best way of solving this problem is to first stop causing it, and then deregulate and make sure that entrepreneurs as easily and as swiftly and as costlessly as possible can reallocate the resources and the capital so that the production structure can be realigned with consumers' actual wants. Whereas for Keynes, it would be the government stepping in with fiscal policy, trying to create another boom, basically, to cover for the bust.
So the government would then assume that it knows enough to be able to make decisions that are going to have a right outcome, as opposed to allowing the marketplace to work itself out. Now, this comes to this idea in the paper that we referenced earlier. The Use of Knowledge in Society was one of his most famous papers. In fact, I think it's one of the best papers in economics that I've read. And in that, he discusses, as I recall, the emphasis on sort of distributed knowledge, okay, and the nature of knowledge when it comes to economic decision making. So Dave, do you have anything that you could elaborate on this idea of how knowledge actually works and what we can and can't know in the context of economics?
Yeah, so Hayek's insights on this front are truly remarkable. So to build up to this a little bit, we have to understand what prices are, right? And most people look at a price like we look at it at the grocery store. This thing costs $3, done. Price is a number. But the question becomes, where does that price come from and what generates it? And if you've taken an economics course, you might say, oh, supply and demand, right? And I would give you at least an A- on that answer, okay? But there's a little bit more to it than that. And the reason there's more to it than that is because what that price is a valuation, right? We're putting a value on that product. Well, where do values come from? They have to come from individuals. And as a result, they are subjective. So I give this example quite a bit, so how many of you like ketchup? Like you put ketchup on literally anything at all, ever, right? So I don't. I think ketchup is disgusting, and it is the most vile thing that has ever been invented. It is evidence that God does not exist, or it would be if I weren't a Catholic, right? And so this is where, my preference for ketchup is nil. I would pay to not have it anywhere near my plate. Same with pickles, by the way, okay? Other people would pay extra to have ketchup and pickles, and that's great. I have a subjective preference that says ketchup and pickles are bad. You may have a subjective preference that says ketchup and pickles are good. How do we compare those subjective preferences? And you might say it's impossible. And to that I say, no, it's not. It's entirely possible, and we can do so through the price mechanism. And so what prices are really doing is they are aggregating all of those subjective preferences and giving us an aggregate objective value for what this thing is that then lets businesses actually make decisions based on this price and the changes in that price. And so what I see in this is really just this beauty of the price mechanism and how it actually operates in our everyday lives and where those prices come from. They're not just numbers. You can't just, as lots of people in the socialist calculation debate said, you can't just pluck a number out of thin air, stick it into a production process, and say, there you go. It's not a question of just picking the right number. It's a question of allowing all these processes to unfold that generates that number in the first place.
Thanks, Dave. One thing I do recall when he talked about prices, at some point he used the example of tin and the changing price of tin. And what I found to be so beautiful about his explanation of, say, the price of tin was that you don't even need to know why the price is changing. It's just not relevant. It somehow has this compact, all you need to know is the direction. And then naturally, responses to incentives will cause the market to adapt to whatever the price change is. Now, this brings into something that I think I'd like to ask you, Per, is the idea of the entrepreneur. So you've done, of course, a number of scholarly work within the realm of entrepreneurship. You're a professor of entrepreneurship. Hayek really doesn't discuss in detail the function of the entrepreneur. He talks about knowledge, but we know that knowledge is also critical in the sense of how the entrepreneur makes use of it in response to it. So could you elaborate a little bit more on entrepreneurship and its connection to perhaps Hayek's thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. I've been actually going through Hayek's work trying to find his theory of entrepreneurship, which is really difficult because he doesn't actually explicitly talk about entrepreneurship and what that means in the economy. It's different if you go to other Austrians. So Menger had his theory explicitly stated, and Mises did as well, and then so forth. To Hayek, it's always there if you read between the lines, but it's not an actual function that he finds worth discussing in detail. So instead, he's talking about the price mechanism, which of course is the output of entrepreneurial action and also the input to entrepreneurial action at the very same time. So when we talked about knowledge, subjective value is an important part of it, but Hayek distinguishes between three kinds of knowledge. Right? So he talks about technical knowledge or scientific knowledge, which is easy to transmit, and of course it's in numbers practically, right? There's circumstantial or local knowledge, which is what you know and not what I know because I'm elsewhere, but I know something about my situation. And both of those go into how we choose to act in certain situations. Then there's also tacit knowledge, which is knowledge that we cannot communicate, but we sort of know it intuitively or as a hunch or something like that. And what entrepreneurs do is deal with all three, of course, because all three affect how they imagine that the world can be and what they can produce and what would be a good opportunity for them in the marketplace. And when they act on that, I mean, that's sort of the mechanism behind aggregating this information, whether it is technical or local or tacit. All of this goes into these actions that then create the output in the form of the price mechanism that others can use, because prices, you can respond to prices. If a price of your input goes up, like in the tin example, of course you're going to stay away, you're going to economize much more on that resource and choose something else if you can. But you don't need to know exactly what made this other guy demand more or pay more for it. So entrepreneurs are sort of the key to understanding the process of forming or determining these prices.
So I have to ask you, so with these different types of knowledge and to be able to grasp the implications of different forms of knowledge, and maybe I'll begin. I'm going to throw a curveball out here and first throw it to Dave. So I can anticipate people saying, oh, if it's just a knowledge problem, well, we've got artificial intelligence now. And so let's just make use of artificial intelligence. and just allow these large language learning models, whatever they call it, however they work, right, to just solve our problems and be able to, now government can do it, right? So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, so this was a big part of the socialist calculation debate in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, was the idea that if we had a powerful enough computer, then we could solve, all the world's problems. We would just feed in information, it would spit out answers, and that would be kind of the end of it. The challenge, though, is as Per was saying, is that there's different types of knowledge. And so all these large language models, all these computers and everything, they use knowledge that exists, already, that I could go and, in principle at least, enter into Excel in some sort of an objective and correct way. But a lot of the knowledge that's necessary and is relevant for economic decision making is wholly unenterable into Excel, both because it's incommunicable. I cannot communicate to you how much I don't like pickles. I can sit here and tell you that I don't like pickles, but I can never get you to fully understand how much I hate pickles. Okay? And so there's that aspect of it. I just can't put that into a spreadsheet. But then there's also this idea of, while I might know something, I can imagine the future, I can't know the future, and I can't know what decisions I'm going to face until I face them, and I can't know what I would do in those unknown decisions until I have to make them. But I would have to know that information before in order to enter it into this machine. Right? And so if I can't even imagine I can't even know the information I would need to enter for this machine to make a decision, it doesn't matter how powerful the computer is, right? It doesn't have complete information, and it cannot have complete information. And I think that's a big part of what Hayek is saying in this essay in particular.
And would this also then include the tacit knowledge that you just can't grasp or put into the large language learning model that you're referring to?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is the part that a large language model cannot deal with, right? Because you cannot put it in Excel. I mean, you can, yes, I can add into Microsoft Excel that Dave minus 2,000 utils for ketchup and whatever, but that doesn't actually mean anything because it doesn't measure anything, and it's just an approximation that is based on nothing at all. And I think an AI can be very effective in using both technical and local knowledge if you feed it into it, of course, if it has access to it. So if we, say, implant chips in all of our brains, then perhaps we can have an output that way. The problem here is that it places the cart before the horse, because what entrepreneurs and others act on is the prices that are generated through people acting on this tacit knowledge, and not all this tacit knowledge, right? So it's not only a problem that we need to centralize all this knowledge that people have in their heads, but also that it's the prices that are the output of their actions and their interactions with each other that form the input to our actions. And this is something that an AI, of course, cannot do. And not to mention then, of course, that an AI doesn't have any subjective valuation and can't understand that concept at all.
Yes, and by the way, since you all both referred to the subjective evaluation, would there others that would assert something different, that value is objective, and how would you respond to that?
There certainly are people who will assert that there are values that are objective, and it's a slippery slope kind of argument, because I certainly don't want to go into the moral relativism arena, but when it comes to economic goods, yes, I did make the claim that prices are an objective measure of their aggregate overall value, if you will, but that doesn't mean that it's valuable to me, right? I'm not going to go buy ketchup just because it's on sale. My wife might, but I'm certainly not going to, right? And I don't know, like as I was saying before, there is a price at which you could give me enough money and I would eat a French fry with ketchup on it. Like, that number exists. I don't know what it is. If any, I could start the bidding right now. We'll start the bidding at $1 million, and I'll eat a French fry with ketchup. No takers? Interesting, right? And so there is a danger, I think, in viewing prices solely as the reflection of an objective value. They're obviously based on subjective valuations, but that doesn't mean we can't know, nothing, even if everything relevant for economics is ultimately subjective.
So yes, there are people who believe in objective value. We refer to them as Marxists. And it's sort of ironic or bad luck for Marx that he wrote his treatise on economics just 4 years before economists realized that, whoops, value is not objective. From the perspective of economics itself, it doesn't really matter how or why people value things. What matters is that they do value things. And then how they might come to value a certain thing over the other and whatever else, that's the realm of psychology. And we can't really figure that out as economists. But we know that they do value things, and we know that they value things differently. Because otherwise there wouldn't be an exchange at all. Right? Because an exchange is simply that I value what you have more than what I give up, and you value what I give you more than you give me. And it's that value inequality that makes trade possible at all. So it's pretty obvious when you think about it that value cannot be objective in terms of the goods. Values, people can have objective values perhaps. That's a different matter completely. But economically speaking, obviously we value things differently.
Yes, actually, I like the way you make that distinction. It prevents us from getting into a moral relativism, right? Because we're making a distinction between value within the context of the marketplace and then sort of an objective moral value. So with Acton Institute, we have the Journal of Markets and Morality. And so we would acknowledge, of course, that there's a subjective valuation in the marketplace, but as one economist once put it, how do you then acknowledge the existence of what we might call the Bible pornography paradox of value, right? At Acton, we would of course say, look, the Bible is objectively far more valuable than something like pornography. But that doesn't address the economic question, where in reality, somebody in the marketplace might actually do something differently that reflects in the prices. So those distinctions between economic value and then objective moral value could be one of the things that Acton would make a distinction with.
So can I add that? Because I think one way of thinking about this is the value in terms of the noun. That's the moral sphere, but value as a verb is economics.
Excellent. Very good distinction. So I want to go back to one other thing that we had discussed briefly. And I guess I've heard the phrase, of course, unintended consequences, or the law of unintended consequences. I don't know if that ever came out of Hayek's thinking or what have you. But however the case is, I think his article and his speech all talk about this implicitly, that the government has no humility in some of its policies that it tries to pursue, and next thing you know, we have all these unanticipated things that happen. Okay, so with that, I want to frame this and maybe start with Dave, because you wrote an article on Doge recently, so and the Doge cutting spending. So I was at a conference in DC about a month ago, and somebody was bringing up the Doge cuts and specifically cuts to USAID, and a person made a very insightful remark. They said, look, directionally, we need to be cutting a lot of these things. But in the end, this is the equivalent, the way it's being done, of our withdrawal from Afghanistan. Okay, it's something that needed to be done, but it's creating all sorts of unintended disasters and so forth. So would you, Dave, agree that if we acknowledge in a Hayekian way that central planners cannot have insights into the specific knowledge that's happening at the decisions that they make, that the reverse is also true when they cut spending? And how would you respond to that as sort of a critique, like, oh, you can't do this? So,
yeah, it's a great question. So, I want to start off and say that, I think it's very clear that we need to do something about spending at the federal level. When you're taking in $5 trillion in revenue and you're spending $7 trillion every single year and you're adding more and more to the deficit, there's a serious problem here, okay? The question is, how do you sort of divest yourself from a problem? And one answer is to just cut it off immediately, okay? And that's certainly one potential solution. But when you've constructed a lot of society around this apparatus that we might call the federal government, and when you've made a lot of people have plans for how certain things are going to work, and then you pull the rug out from under them, that is going to cause significant challenges, especially when the only thing you're really doing is changing the amount of spending that you're doing. Okay, so this is what Doge has been focusing on. They've been focusing on how much money it costs to do whatever task is being done. But what my article that I wrote about in American Spectator, what I said in there is what we really need to do is look at not so much starving the beast of resources. We've tried that, and what happens is deficits explode. Instead, what we could do is look at the responsibilities that we have delegated to the federal government and ask a serious question. Is this a legitimate use for the federal government? Or is this a legitimate role for the federal government? And there, my argument is very Hayekian, right? In the sense that a lot of the knowledge, and dare I say most of the knowledge that is relevant for economic decision making, that is relevant for entrepreneurs, the policy needs to come from the arena that is most closely attached to those people. So in this case, what I'm advocating for is federalism, a return to federalism. The idea that the local governments have the most say over your life. The state governments have the second most, and the federal government has by far the least. And there, what you would have is policy making that better matches the citizenry. Now, yes, there might be some incongruencies. People in Alabama might get a different education, for example, than people in Michigan. But that might be okay. They're certainly not going to learn, that 2 + 2 is 5 in Alabama, but they might learn something different that is not relevant to people in Michigan. And that might be okay. It might not. I don't know the answer. But my argument in that piece was, rather than starving the government of resources and then leaving all those rules in place and at some level unattended, creating chaos and disruption, what we should look at is taking down the rules themselves, returning that power to the state, honoring at some level the 10th Amendment, which I think is the most underappreciated amendment of all the amendments. And when you do that, the need for tax revenues will necessarily fall, at which point the revenues that government collects can also fall.
So thank you, Dave, for explaining in great detail Acton's core principle of the rule of law and subsidiary role of government. That's critical, yes, so it's one of our core principles. So Pert, any additional thoughts on that topic of cutting, et cetera?
Well, I'm all for cutting. So I think a problem here is that whenever you implement some kind of regulation or something like that, you're going to cause more problems, and you're going to cause some dependence on that regulation. And a problem is it's a one-size-fits-all to begin with, and it works as well for clothing as it does for government. Rolling back is sort of problematic because some people have a lot of income and a lot of benefits that depend on each and every regulation, which means rolling it back. I think the reason we have so much resistance to rolling back things one by one, step by step, is that every time there are concentrated benefits that hurt some people a lot, whereas the benefits of rolling it back are, distributed, and people might gain a little bit, but not compared to the people who are harmed by rolling that back. So I think very often reform or deregulation is made impossible just because you've already created this dependence. So sometimes it's just better to chop it off, all of it completely. And of course it would be better to have as local government as possible, because that would reflect people in the actual circumstances, to take it back to Hayek, right, where you can use the local knowledge and have solutions that fit those people and that might not fit the next village or town over.
So you said something in there that I want to seize upon and elaborate a little bit more, because it pertains to a very current event, and that is the gains are widely dispersed and not particularly visible. The harms are very concentrated and very visible, which is one of the challenges that free traders have to deal with. When we say, look, trade barriers are inevitably going to promote prosperity if we remove those trade barriers, but you're going to see losses, and they're going to be very visible, and you can't detect the aggregation of all of the benefits that people don't quite sense. Now, of course, we have movement in the opposite direction, and my guess is that there are going to be so-called wins, right, with higher trade barriers, bringing back manufacturing in certain cities or what have you, and I'm already hearing reports of these. So how can we make use of Hayek's understanding of the use of knowledge, the distribution of knowledge, and the tariff debates that are going on today? So maybe I'll start with you, Dave, and then we'll go to Per.
Yeah, so this is an area that I have spent a lot of time working on, especially in the last 2 weeks. So as you've seen, I'm sure, is since January 20th, we have changed our tariff policy 27 times. That's certainly a record. I don't know if that's a record we should be proud of, ashamed of, or even have thoughts on. But here's kind of the thing, and we can think about this in the context of previous forays into tariff policy. So if I were to tell you that President Trump is not the first to use tariffs, would you be shocked or surprised by this? Because if you look at the media, all of a sudden you might see, finally we have a president getting tough on China. Like, okay, let's think about this. 2002, President Bush imposed tariffs on Chinese steel. The effect was so dramatic and severe that both Republicans and Democrats repudiated him, and he ended those tariffs 2 years before he actually intended to. In 2009, President Obama imposed tariffs on Chinese tires, in part in response to them dumping tires on the domestic market. And so what happened? Well, the price of tires rose 21.7%, and as a result, people bought fewer tires from everyone. Now, you might recall this, maybe, or maybe not, but if you were driving on the highway in 2009, 2012, you may have noticed that there were a whole bunch of shredded truck tires on the side of the road. Why was that? Because tires were expensive, and people bought less of them. In fact, they switched to retreading tires. And so retreaded tires are literally gluing new tread onto tires. Those blow out fairly regularly. Not as quickly as a balding tire, but still fairly regularly. And so when those tariffs ended in 2012, the price of tires came down. Truck drivers in particular were able to replace their tires more regularly. And as a result, you don't see tires on the side of the road. It wasn't a massive increase in the spending on cleaning up the roads, I can assure you. In 2018, President Trump imposed tariffs on Chinese steel and aluminum. What happened? Well, in the immediate term, we saw about 1,000 jobs protected in the steel and aluminum producing sectors, but we also saw 75,000 manufacturing jobs across the country destroyed. And so this speaks to Hayek's insights here, is a lot of times when we intend to do one particular thing, in this case, save the domestic steel and aluminum sectors, the downstream effects can be, and often are, quite large. Now, when it comes to those steel and aluminum producing jobs, that the 1,000 jobs saved, most of those have been eliminated in the following years, partly due to COVID, I won't dispute that, but also because when the price of steel and aluminum rose, which it did, it's up about 40% from where it was in 2017, 2016. When that happens, entrepreneurs are going to find substitutes for those goods. Well, that means that they're going to be purchasing less steel and aluminum. And if they're purchasing less steel and aluminum producing companies don't have to make as much. And where do you find the concentration on the reduction in productivity? Well, it's going to be in labor, right? You can't fire a factory, but you can fire an employee. And you can run those furnaces a little bit less often, or at least a little bit less hard. And so what ended up happening is somewhere to the tune of 75 to 85,000 jobs in manufacturing have been destroyed by Trump's tariffs in 2017. What will happen with these current tariffs? I don't know. But history, evidence, theory, and logic says that it will not be a net gain for manufacturing.
Thank you, Dave. Anything to add to that, Per?
Sure, I think Hayek's thought here dovetails with Bastiat's seen and the unseen, right? That yes, we can see these businesses that go under, but we can't see what we're getting instead. So rolling back these regulations, of course we're going to get, as economists, we know that we're going to get a marketplace that is more in tune with consumers in general. But we can see that this business goes under and these jobs are disappear and are destroyed, that sort of thing. And this is what we're seeing in the market process overall with the creative destruction. That yes, this business is gone now, and there are fewer farm jobs today than there was 150 years ago. Well, where are all the unemployed farmers? Well, there are other jobs, and there are more productive ways to use them. But we don't see that in that moment because those people are getting unemployed for a month, half a year, maybe 18 months, something like that, while other businesses get this opportunity to use their knowledge and their competencies to create more value for us. So I mean, it's not a surprise perhaps that Hayek's thought dovetails with Bastiat's, but I mean, it's a long and proud tradition in economics.
Thank you for that. I'm sure we'll get some more sort of current event type questions here in the Q&A in a moment. But before we do that, I have one more question that kind of gets back to fundamental principles. And I'll confess that although I had read numerous times his essay, The Use of Knowledge in Society, it wasn't until preparing for this panel that I actually went back and read his Nobel lecture. And so the Pretence of Knowledge. And there was one thing, and so when we make, and he makes distinctions between the kinds of knowledge you've already brought up, both of you, but he also notes, scientism, or the idea that the social sciences can do the very same things that the physical sciences can do, is one of his big critiques. Of course, we know that economics is the study of human action under conditions of scarcity, and once you put that human element, you get into the subjective things that you discussed before. So he has one thing in his lecture that just brought to attention something I've always been wondering about. It's not quite economic related, so it's a little bit of a curveball. But he says, he uses the analogy, if we had all the knowledge of players in a ball game, okay, their disposition, their strength, how they're feeling that day, et cetera, if we could put that all together, we could come up with some we could clearly predict the outcome of the game. And he uses that idea of a ball game. And immediately I started thinking about watching the NFL in the fall and Amazon Web Services and the predictability they'll show. What are the odds of that pass being caught by that receiver? And I've always kind of chuckled at that, right? So here's an element of human action, and it's being applied statistically to NFL and data analytics, et cetera. What would Hayek say about this? Is there any value in it? Is it generally helpful? Is it, yeah, so what would you say that? Maybe I'll begin with you, Dave, and then we'll finish up with Per, and then I'll go to the audience.
So I always find, I watch the NFL for the same things, and I chuckle at those statistics as well. I'm like, what does it mean to have a 10% chance of making the catch? In the past, he made the catch. There's a 100% chance that the pass happened. And so it's always interesting, like, how did you pull that number up? But to the point, you know, a football game has 22 players on the field, right? 22 players, you know, yes, they're human beings, they're infinitely complex, whatever, right? You can model that fairly regularly. Do it with 380 million, then do it with 8 billion. It's going to be a lot harder.
Thank you, Dave. How about you, Per?
So I disagree a little bit here. And not that you can't aggregate this, of course. But I think the issue here is that in a sports game, you already have all the rules in place, and you know the outcome. You know the whole framework is there, and you know what they're all aiming for. They're aiming to score, and you know what the score means. Yeah. In the marketplace, you don't have that. It's open-ended, right? So it's much easier to predict. If you would have a chip in people's brains and whatnot else, on the field, you could perhaps predict very closely how the at least the game will end, right? And I think Bing, the search engine, they used to have some kind of predictor on who would win the game, and they tended to be about 2/3 right, but the rest of it was, I mean, it's messy data, and you can't record everything, so you can't predict perfectly, but you could never get to that kind of level of being right in the marketplace, because of innovation, because of entrepreneurship, because people change their minds, because value is subjective, because all of these things, right? So if in a sports game that is open-ended, that doesn't have, say, a soccer game with 2 goals and 11 players on each team and 2 times 45 minutes, you don't have that, but instead the players can invent new ways of scoring. Right. Then you can't predict at all. And that's what the marketplace is.
I'm glad you entered that, an open-ended game. Right. So the game itself is one thing, but then this reminds me of Moneyball, right? Yeah. So Moneyball can maybe work for a time, and you end up taking a very team that doesn't win anything and end up winning the World Series, right? But then everybody's going to learn from that. And the marketplace has changed, and people adapt, right? Yeah. So that's a great distinction between the two of you. So I'd like to now shift to the audience, and we will have microphones that are being passed around. So please raise your hand and feel free to ask our panelists any questions that you'd like. And we have, I think, about just a little over 20 minutes of Q&A.
So Hayek dedicated The Road to Serfdom to socialists of all parties. And the United States of America, roughly beginning around the end of World War II, one of the factions of American political and civic life, if not one of the parties, had largely absorbed and accepted and operationalized the insights that you've been talking about today. And then I recall not too long ago, the man who's now Secretary of State of the United States of America wrote a piece in favor of industrial policy done right, as if the problem with everybody before that was they never thought to try to do it right. What do you, A, think the consequences are of the falling away of these lessons from the people who are making these kinds of decisions? And is it just a Burkean thing where example is the school of mankind and he shall learn it no other, and we have to go through these this kind of tumult in order to relearn these lessons and have another faction or so that will be able to be there making these kinds of arguments that aren't fun to make because you don't get to make the choices and do the fun stuff that people in those places of power want to do?
So I think this is the fun thing because I have no responsibility for outcomes. I can just point out problems, right? So it's kind of perfect. But you're exactly right. I think it's remarkable the number of columns that have come out, especially in the last 6 months, that say, whatever policy done right? Or smart military strategy, or smart grids, or whatever, right? And it's remarkable the arrogance, if I will, that these people have to say that everyone that came before them, the problem was they were dumb. And the problem is that they just didn't do it right. They intentionally did it wrong. And so to me, the danger is that we think that this time will be different. And we've all heard that before. And there's just this funny little thing called history. I don't know if anyone in the audience has ever heard of it. But yeah, John's heard of it once or twice in passing. But there's this funny little thing called history, and there's this other, adjoining thing called evidence. And history and evidence are all pretty clear. This time will not be different. The problem with tariffs is not their execution. It is with the thing itself.
So I think this constant warring with socialism and socialist ideals is a war that cannot be won. And what I mean by that is not, let's just become socialist and get it over with. What I mean is that every generation starts with socialist ideas and socialist mindset because we're sort of programmed that way. But then we learn that, it's not that easy. It's not that simple. And there's so much more that I didn't know. I mean, we're sort of born arrogant, to use Dave's term, right? And I think we have this experience on college campuses that students tend to think in terms of central planning. And part of this might be something they learned in K through 12, but part of it is also that it's natural. And you have to study and learn economics to understand it. Wait a minute, there's something we're missing here. And that's sort of the power of learning economics, but learning sound economics, not learning math economics. So I think when I say it's a war that cannot be won, what I mean is we have to keep on fighting this fight and keep on teaching people, because this is this is knowledge that is not intuitive for a lot of people. So we have to continue to communicate how the world actually works and help people uncover those processes, which is what economics does.
Yeah, so your comments stirred a memory of another of Hayek's writings in the Constitution of Liberty, I believe it was, where he talks about the difference between sort of the microcosmos and the macrocosmos. So the microcosmos is like your intimate order. It's your friends, your family, the people with whom you are physically and spiritually and everything else close to. But then there's the macrocosmos, and that's sort of the realm of how you interact with people that are like not necessarily friends, but they're still people, right? And so I treat, my son Wesley, who's 5, very differently than I do the person who sells me groceries at the grocery store, right? And the reason isn't because I value the grocer less than my son. I do, but for different reasons, right? She's not less of a person than my child, right? But what Hayek writes in this work is that if we were to apply the rules of the macro to the micro, which would be, when my son and I and my family sit down at dinner, and everything, and I look at my son and say, okay, there's 3 dino nuggets on the table, let's bid, right? Who's gonna bid the most for those dino nuggets? I don't charge my son money to eat dinner. That would be gauche for a litany of reasons. And so that order, that familial order that I apply to my friends and family, can I extend that to the macro, to society writ large? And the answer is no. And Hayek says explicitly, if I were to apply the rules of the macro to the micro, in other words, charge my son money at the dinner table, I would destroy the relationship that I have with my son and my family and my friends. But likewise, if I were to apply the rules of the micro to the macro, I would also destroy that. And that's where I think people see when they're younger, we only see that microcosmos. Of course I'm not going to charge, mom and dad money. Or of course they're not going to charge me money for this. Right? Of course we're going to share our toys. Of course we're going to do all these things. But as we grow and develop, we enter that macro world. And that's where we need to understand that while it's similar, it has different rules that we have to abide by.
Thank you for that. I think there was another hand. Yes?
Thanks, guys. One of the things that comes to mind when I check out the Doge website periodically, they do cover spending. They also do have an index of how many words are in our regulations. So no announcements there, but I'm assuming that once they're done chainsawing one thing, they're going to cut the next log. And one of the things I think about when it comes to regulations is, you mentioned malinvestment, and how much malinvestment there is in terms of human ingenuity and thought process to comply with regulations. And I'm curious, is there anything that comes out of Hayek or any of the things that you're aware of that gives us a framework for how to think of when I don't even know if we've ever rolled back regulations in any major way, but if we do, what's the hidden value there, so to speak?
So I'll jump in and give Per time to think about that because it's a really good question. But here's what I will say is we've gotten to a point where, how many of you remember in 2009, and the years after that, everyone was blaming the financial crisis on deregulation, right? We've deregulated the banking sector, and that's what led to the Great Recession. That's what led to the housing crisis. That's what led to all the problems in society. The truth of the matter is we didn't deregulate. We just regulated slower, right? And so we're now calling a change in the growth of regulations, a decrease in the growth rate of regulations. That's now referred to as deregulation, right? The same is true of spending, by the way. So you may have heard during the debates last fall that certain people would say, oh, this plan will lead to $2 trillion less in the deficit. Okay, well, that's against a projection that says by 2035, the federal debt will be $52 trillion. And you're telling me that you're only going to grow the debt to $50 trillion, not that we're going to go from 36 trillion that we're at right now to 34. You're talking about only growing it to 50 trillion, and we're calling that a savings. That's like going out and buying a brand new car that costs like $100,000 and then not buying one next year and saying, look at me, I just saved 100 grand. No, you didn't. You just didn't buy a car, right? And so we're now at a point where we're celebrating a decrease in the growth rate of certain things and calling that a decline.
So now that I've had a little time to think about this, thank you, Dave. So I think from a Hayekian perspective, I think what we're missing is all the local and tacit knowledge, because that's not part of what entrepreneurs can do in a highly regulated economy, right? So they cannot meet consumers where consumers are at because they don't get access to this knowledge, and they also cannot use it because they're restricted in what they do, right? So I personally have a little bit of different spin on this. So from an entrepreneurship perspective, what entrepreneurs do is imagine a future that they can create for consumers. So they try to create as a valuable future as possible. And every regulation, of course, narrows the scope of what they can and are allowed to imagine. So every regulation then will cause some entrepreneurs to not act on what they think is the best way to serve consumers, but instead maybe the second best or the third best. Or they will just say, nah, I won't do anything at all. So another entrepreneur will instead get a chance. But in either case, it's going to be lower valued outcome. At least the expectation is lower. But that's one regulation. Then you add one more, and then you add 80,000 pages of just the tax code. And then you can, it's pretty obvious that we're talking about malinvestment and that the whole production apparatus is not directed to where entrepreneurs think that they will create most value for consumers. It's directed to where they can at all produce some value for consumers, right? And very often, of course, they also produce for the government more than for consumers. So in a sense, to speak a little French, the whole economy is a shit show because of this. And I think Hayek would agree, but he might use German instead. But he would agree that all this knowledge and all this variation in understanding of what is going on is simply lost.
So I'll give a concrete example. So one thing that can happen when there's regulation is exactly what you said. It obviously is going to limit the scope of what can be imagined. But it's also going to create a new type of entrepreneurship, which we could call political entrepreneurship. And that is the entrepreneurial effort to circumvent rules. So one of my favorite examples is the Jones Act. The Jones Act is a 1920s law that says that any ship going from U.S. ports has to be U.S. flagged, U.S. owned, and U.S. crewed. Okay? And so, but there are exemptions to this, particularly if the ship happens to, or if the cargo happens to have been on a railroad in Canada at some point during its journey. And so what some clever entrepreneurs, and I will call them entrepreneurs, found or did, is they built a 200-foot railroad at a dock in British Columbia. And what they would do is they would dock the ship, put all the cargo on the rail car, send it 100 feet that way, 100 feet back, put it back on the ship, and they said, ha-ha, we qualify for the exemptions to the Jones Act. Now, I would call that entrepreneurship. I would also call that non-productive entrepreneurship, or what Kersner would say, superfluous discovery. Right? It's not producing any value for the people or for the consumer. It is merely preventing the destruction of value through these onerous regulations.
Great example. Question in the back.
Yes, thank you for your conversation here today. In 1930, John Maynard Keynes wrote a very short essay called The Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, where he said in 100 years we would be solving the economic problem through technological innovation, and we'd all be working 15-hour work weeks. He kind of posits this idea. That's what most people quote from that essay. Well, 100 years is now, essentially, and we're not working 15-hour work weeks. And just 3 weeks ago, Bill Gates, on the Jimmy Fallon show of all places, posited that in the next 10 years, we will be doing somewhat of the same thing. Because of artificial intelligence, we'll be working 15-hour work weeks and all be artists. If you could channel Hayek, what kind of what barrier or what are Keynes and Gates missing? If you could channel Hayek, how would he respond to some of these predictions?
Do you want me to give you some time?
No, I can go. I could go right now.
Okay, go for it.
So Vincent Geloso, one of my dear friends and one of my favorite economists at George Mason University now, did actually look into Keynes's claim, right? And what he finds is that over the last 100 years, work weeks have shortened significantly. Now, they're not at 15 hours, that's true. But I think that reflects less about, the economic condition, if you will, and more about the idea that because of economic progress, we've all been able to find work that is more meaningful to ourselves. For me, I get to stay home and write about economics all day. And if my boss, Sam Gregg, told me I had to stop at 15 hours, I would sneak hours 16 through 20 in there, no problem. And in case Sam watches this, don't worry, I work more than 20 hours a week, right? But to me, I think it speaks more to the dignifying aspect of work for people. There is a certain value that we ascribe to the fact that we have produced value that day, not just because we get, monetary, benefits from doing so, but we get those psychic benefits, those benefits of, I did a good job today, or I helped people today, right? And that's just worth something. So I don't think we're ever going to get to 15 hours per week of work. Will it continue to decline? Yes, of course it will. As economic progress continues, yeah, we'll work less and less and less. But I don't think it's ever going to get to 15. And I certainly don't think Bill Gates is right that it'll cut by another 10 or whatever over the next 10 years.
Right. So in a sense, with this intensive division of labor that we have, the distinction between labor and leisure is sort of blurry. Yeah. Right. So many of us have the great benefit of having a job, labor, where we actually enjoy what we're doing, which is unheard of throughout most of humans' history. Right. So in that sense, we'll choose to work more just because it's fun, instead of working less. But I think regulation also has a place here, right? So people will work, even in jobs they hate, for more hours than they otherwise would choose, because you have perks and benefits and things like that, if if you work a certain number of hours. What is it? Obamacare requires 30 or 35 a week, right, to get health care insurance. So of course, if you drop below that, then you're going to lose your health care. Well, that's a big penalty for those hours, right? So of course, it's going to be a benefit to work more hours, even if you really hate your job. So I mean, they're both of those things push towards working more hours, but that also means more output, for at least in most jobs.
Do we have another question?
So Dave, your boss, Sam Gregg, was on my web show not too long ago talking about free trade, and I agreed with him on tariffs. But toward the end, we didn't have a lot of time to talk. I did throw him the question of, okay, how do you prevent a malign actor from cornering the market and causing you great difficulties in, protecting your country? He took the kind of bob and weave and said, stop doing stupid things. And you both have said that's no longer a fair answer, so I'm going to throw it to you. Agreeing with you on the tariff situation, how do we protect our country when it comes to critical things like rare earth elements?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I am certainly no Sam Gregg, but I will try to give an answer that's not just a bob and weave. So I think it's fair to say that the pandemic in particular exposed a weakness that supply chains around the world have, namely that almost all of them run through China at some point or another. Now, we can get into a debate about whether we should divest ourselves from China, whether China's a bad actor in need of punishment. Those are certainly wonderful debates, and I welcome them, perhaps after we're done here. But I think what we have seen is the dangers of relying on a hyper-concentrated supply chain running through one country, right? Even if they were one of our best friends, that's still a very dangerous situation, right? In Grand Rapids, for example, we have lots of different grocery stores. If we only had one, that would be a critical failure, right? That would be a source of a big problem. And so I think what we're seeing now is a desire to diversify those supply chains such that they go through more than just China. It's probably inevitable that China will remain a major component or a major player in virtually every supply chain for the next several decades, no matter what comes out of the White House in the next 3 minutes. But I think that what we've learned is that there has to be some change away from that. Now, how do you get to that change is a really good question, and I'm not going to pretend to have the answer to it, but I can certainly empathize and agree with the desire and need to diversify supply chains such that they're not all running through China.
I think we have time for one more question. If not, I will ask the last question. Oh.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Earlier we talked about cutting spending and kind of turning organizations towards like federalism and giving them back to the states. How can we as Americans, I guess, support cutting like USAID, the International Peace Institute, things that I don't think states could do, and that as at least regional hegemon, the United States kind of, at least I see it, has that job to take care of other countries and promote democracy and peace. So maybe I missed it in the lecture and we already went over it, but how would you respond to cutting those things that states can't necessarily take care of?
Well, I have no idea what Hayek would say to this, to be honest. Yeah. But to me, it's really a matter of what the state should do versus what society should do. And I don't think the state should be involved in doing practically any of this at all. Simply because the state is based on force and violence, and it uses funds that it has expropriated from people. And people themselves are so much more effective in investing their funds into what are actual values, with an S, the noun, and it actually worth something to people in general than state bureaucrats are. So a voluntarist approach would be better, and would take to bring this back to Hayek, would take advantage of people's local understanding of how other people might benefit more. And bureaucrats simply don't have that information and not even the interest.
Yeah, I would echo similar sentiments. You know, I certainly feel for people around the world who are suffering in abject poverty and living under oppressive regimes. You know, that's certainly a thing that I think as a society we should try to find a way to resolve. The question then becomes, you know, what are the appropriate means of doing so? And we need to think about both the accessibility of the knowledge necessary to implement, you know, I'm going to use the phrase good reforms or good policies or good interventions. And then also the incentives that might also be created through both creating those incentives and also in the creation of those incentives. And there, I think the challenge is, you know, do I suspect that any particular federal, state, local entity is going to have both the knowledge and the incentives to do that? And to me, the answer seems to be no. And that doesn't mean that I'm advocating for throwing our hands up and doing nothing, but it also means that I can't tell you exactly what we should do.
What a terrific discussion here on the 50th anniversary of Hayek's Nobel Prize. Would you please join me in welcoming or in thanking our panelists, Dr. Per Byland and Dr. David Hebert. I'd also like to thank the Austrian Economics Center for the opportunity to collaborate with them in this Free Market Roadshow. Thank you to the audience for joining us both here in person and online. Just a real quick announcement. You can always check our acton.org website to go to the events page to see what other events we have coming up here in the near future. But of course, the big one is Acton University, which is June 23rd through 26th in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We hope you can join us. Thanks so much for joining us today and have a great afternoon.